My name is Nancy. I'm the manager here at the Cameron Park Library. I really want to welcome you to this wonderful event. Our library system is just so grateful to have been participating in California Reads, our Search for Democracy. There couldn't be a better place in a library to do that. We also want to thank the California State Library. We want to thank the California Center for the Book. We want to thank Cal Humanities for participating in this grant, and our always generous friends of the library for helping this happen tonight. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Jeanne. Thank you very much.
When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the Hawaiian Islands on December 7, 1941, I was 7 years old. And this tragic act plunged the United States into World War II. As those of you who read the book, has anybody read the book here? Yeah, so you know, I was the youngest of 10 children, and my father was a commercial fisherman in Southern California, who lived in Santa Monica. Where he had 2 fishing boats, which he called the Golden Hind and the Neary. Now, my father was an Issei, or of the first generation, which means he was born in Japan and immigrated here to this country. He came in 1904 when he was 17 years old. So that makes him a pioneer to the West Coast. Just as some of your ancestors may have come to the east coast of America from Europe or Africa or to California or Mexico and Central and South America. Now, my mother was Nisei, of the second generation, an American citizen, because she was born in Hawaii, which was then a territory of the United States, and that was in 1897. As you know, Hawaii became a state in 1959. So with my father, Issei, and my mother, Issei, my brothers and sisters and myself were somewhere between the 2 generations. But we tended, well, actually what happened was that the older brothers and sisters thought of themselves as Issei, the 5 older, and the 5 younger, we thought of ourselves as Sansei, or 3rd generation. Now, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a very unfortunate thing happened. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered the relocation and internment of persons dangerous to the security of the United States. Now, this was supposed to mean anyone who was dangerous to American national security. As a result of this, the entire Japanese American population on the West Coast was rounded up and put into 10 main camps in various remote parts of the country. So this meant 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent, of whom almost 70% were native-born American citizens, like myself, born in this country, were uprooted from their homes and communities and removed to strange lands. Many people first were put into fairgrounds and racetracks, forced to live in horse stalls until the more permanent camps were built. These were the assembly centers. Manzanar was the first permanent camp to open when our family arrived there in April of 1942. Now, America was at war with Italy and Germany too, but only Japanese American families were rounded up and imprisoned in concentration camps. So when I talk about concentration camps, I'm not comparing it to what happened in Germany, okay? It was where people were concentrated. Let's face it, what happened happened to the Jews in Germany, those were death camps. They weren't concentration camps. Now, why was this possible? How could this happen in America? Land of freedom and equality. So what were the factors that led to this? First is panic. Panic and fear, although 3,000 miles away in the Pacific. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was the closest thing to the invasion the United States had ever experienced. And there was hysteria. And unfortunately, the newspapers and radio fed this fear with irresponsible journalism, fanning hatred and irrational response with intense propaganda. So remember, in those days, there was no TV. So it was just listen on the radio and you read the paper. So you didn't see the actual pictures. I mean, you know, somebody, a newscaster interviewing elderly women and children being led in, you know, into these desolate camps. So it was kind of a secretive thing. People didn't know about it, what was happening. The military was the first to propose removing the Japanese from the West Coast. And they soon received authorization from President Roosevelt with Executive Order 9066. Even though the head of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, claimed the Japanese were not a security threat. In his judgment, overwhelmingly a loyal immigrant group. But it was overruled by the Western War Command headed by General John DeWitt. And Executive Order 9066 was put into action, but only against the Japanese, not against the Italians, not against the Germans, even though we were also at war with them. A very powerful factor allowed this injustice to go forward, and it cannot be ignored, and that was racism. Since the Chinese immigrants first arrived in the 1840s to work in the mines and for the railroad, they probably came around here, right? It's in this area. There had been intense anti-Asian feelings on the West Coast. Now, this is more than 100 years ago. And at that time in California, there was a great labor shortage. And big companies began to look to the east for workers. So the first Asian arrivals were often seen as striking, simply because they looked different, they were strangers, and they spoke a different language, ate different food. So soon after building railroads and providing backbreaking labor for the development of the West Coast, because that is what they did, they saved their money and began having businesses, and they began buying land. They became economic competitors. Well, we're going back to where the Chinese now are becoming not rich, but they're able to stop doing back labor intensive work and to buy land. Now, this economic, quote, threat spurred legislation to prevent Asians from owning land, and this is how they did it. First, in 1911, a law was passed which prevented aliens or non-American citizens of Asian background from becoming citizens. And then 2 years later, in 1913, another law was passed denying citizenship, denying ownership of land to non-citizens. So first, they couldn't become a citizen, and then another law was passed to say that if you're not a citizen, you can't own land in California. Thus, my father, who came to this country in 1904, who contributed to its growth as a pioneer, could not become a citizen, nor could he own land until 1952, when the Walter Ricarian McCarran Immigration and Nationality Act allowed him the right to naturalize. And that was the year I graduated from high school. Despite these racially imposed barriers, many families prospered. The Japanese were very successful farmers and fishermen, and by 1941, they controlled 40% of the truck farming business in California. But with the forced internment, most of these families lost their properties and businesses and dropped out of American society for an average of 3 years, actually longer. Because after the war was over and the camps closed, most preferred to slip back into their communities unnoticed. Still reeling from the massive displacement, there was fear of further racism. Rumors of lynching, house burnings, and violence had swept to the camps. Jobs and housing were scarce. And the majority was at economic zero. And most of the public were unaware then of the 100th Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And these safe fighting units that fought so valiantly in Europe, earning more Purple Hearts and medals than any other military group of its size. They were young Japanese-American soldiers, some volunteers from Hawaii, and others drafted out of the camps, and some who proved their loyalty, the ultimate loyalty, by sacrificing their lives. 35,000 Japanese Americans, men and women, served in the armed forces during World War II. 2,500 in Pacific Theater as military intelligence soldiers. Called MacArthur's secret weapon, their intelligence work is reported to have shortened the war in the Pacific by a year. But still for many, the recovery period after the war was very harsh, with survival from day to day their only goal. Now, World War II took place more than 70 years ago, 1941 to 1945. Farewell to Manzanar was written 30 years later, and since its publication in 1973, I have spoken to many groups about the internment experience. And always, two questions are asked. One, why did it take you so long to tell your story? Why 30 years after the event? And two, do I think it could ever happen again in America? So I'm going to now get personal, and we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk to you about how the book began. For many years, Manzanar remained a dim memory, something the family rarely talked about. I used to think I dreamt those years in camp, and it wasn't until almost 30 years later that I revived those dreams and collaborated with my husband to write about them. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley at the time, came to visit me in Santa Cruz. He was taking a sociology class, and for the first time in his life, outside of talk from the family, he heard the word Manzanar. Auntie, he said, you know, I was born in Manzanar, and I don't know anything about that place. Can you tell me something about it? For those of you who read the book, do you remember the chapter when my sister goes into the hospital on Christmas and she had a baby 2 days later? That's baby. Because he's growing up now, he's a student at Berkeley. You know, did I read this part? I would read it again. I lost my place. He said, Auntie, he said, you know, I was born in Manzanar, and I don't know anything about that place. Can you tell me something about it? His professor had pointed out the existence of camps, but that was all. Until then, Manzanar had seemed more a family myth than an actual fact to my nephew. Sure, I said. But why didn't you ask your folks? I have, said, but they seemed reluctant, like I shouldn't be asking when there's some skeleton in the closet I'm not supposed to know about. Well, that's strange, I said. Now, whenever our family talked about camp, which wasn't often, we joked about things such as the lousy food, the dust storms, the communal showers. We talked lightheartedly about the outdoor smoothies, the baseball games, and the school. So I proceeded to tell the same story in the same superficial way as if I was sharing some summer camp experience. And my nephew just looked at me very intently, very quiet, and then he said, Auntie, that's bizarre. You were locked up. You were in a prison. I mean, how did you feel about that? And for a moment, I was stunned. He asked a question no one had ever asked before, a question I had never dared to ask myself. How did I feel? And for the first time in my life, I dropped the cover of humor and nonchalance, and I allowed myself to feel. And I began to cry, and I couldn't stop. My poor nephew was upset. What had he done to set his auntie into such hysterics? And then I realized why his parents were unable to tell him about Manzanar. And at the time, I was auntie to 33 nieces and nephews. 21% in our family. 7 had been born in camp, and I was certain none knew about the birthplace. So I decided to write a memoir, a history, just for the family. But I found that whenever I tried to write, I would break down and cry hysterically. So I turned to my husband, a writer and teacher of writing at University of California, Santa Cruz, and I told him of my trouble. What memoir? Yeah. Now, Jim and I had been married 14 years at that time, and I had known him for 5 years before we married, and I had never told him about Manzanar. He knew of some camp in my background, but I had never revealed my experience, and especially my feelings. So I did. And after, he said, this is not a story just for your family. It's a story everyone in America should know. Let's work on this together. Thus began a collaboration that lasted for a year. I talked for hours into a tape recorder, and we interviewed families and other internees and researched the library. The months spent delving into those 3 years of my childhood and its aftermath was as powerfully therapeutic as years with a psychiatrist, and a lot cheaper. We found there were already 40 books written on the internment, but they were mostly academic and political. We found no personal stories from internees themselves that addressed the emotional and psychological damage of their experience. Not only was there the Japanese cultural attitude, shikata ga nai, it's over and can't be helped, forget about it. The phenomenon of post-traumatic stress syndrome, unknown 30 years ago, had silenced most internees. Today, we know how the experience of death, divorce, sexual abuse, and parental alcoholism can remain buried in the subconscious until the memory resurfaces years later, and it usually takes from 20 or 30 years. For many internees, the original shocks of law, family upheaval, and quote, guilt, were suppressed for many years. I realized the feeling I carried about the incarceration was one of deep humiliation, like a person who has been raped. You are the victim, yet you are sullied by that experience and ashamed to draw attention to it. For years, I somehow felt guilty with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Somehow, I must have been responsible for that infamous event. When I had asked my mother, why are we in this prison camp? And I was then too young to understand war and politics. She said, it's because we are Japanese. She didn't say anything about a war with Japan. So in my mind, it was not only bad to be Japanese, it was criminal. Feeling guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor is somewhat similar to the feeling many Americans have for the atomic blast over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thus, crimes of a government can become sins of the people, especially in the hearts and minds of innocent children. Like the Vietnam vets, it took from 20 to 30 years for the defenses to wear down. The time has come for a communal catharsis, a healing for the Japanese American community and also for the United States. Spurred by diligent young Sankei lawyers, the struggle for justice culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the government's actions and offered monetary compensation to survivors of the camp. Now, this victory was not for Japanese Americans alone. It was a great victory for all Americans, because the internment was an important American issue, not just a Japanese American one. Because for the first time in the history of this country, in 1942, all three branches of our government violated the Constitution, the highest law of the land. The Civil Liberties Act proved, this is the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, proved our Constitution is not just a piece of parchment under glass in the National Archives. It is a living, vital contract that binds us all together as Americans. And if that contract is broken, as it had been in 1942, it is not just the rights of individuals that are threatened, but the very fabric of this great democratic nation. Today, there are all too many politicians and irresponsible media who find scapegoats to blame for the country's problems. And more, it seems, those scapegoats are immigrants. How often do we hear they are different from us, have no idea of democracy and freedom? They won't speak our language. They take our jobs. How many of us who lived through the racism and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II remember what it was like to have those very words directed against one innocent group? But today, we should know better. We have the shoulders of Martin Luther King and others to stand upon. Our consciousness has changed. And because of this, our task is greater. For now we are in a partnership, a complex relationship where we must learn about each other. No longer do we live in the simplistic structure of one group authoritatively dominating. It's obvious to me when I was doing that, because I love meeting with my friends instead of meeting with the family, but the authorities then saw, the sociologists who came to study it, said, oh, this is bad for their family makeup, and Japanese families were very tight, structure with the father and the boss and etc. So they're always just breaking up. And of course, eating together, that's a very close thing that we do as a family, eating together. One time you sit down. It was certainly the most fun time that I could remember growing up, was eating around a big round table, all my 10 brothers and sisters, and, throwing food. Well, that changed. Those family structure just really broke down. And when you think of it, all we did was sleep in a bed. We didn't even have a bathroom, it was just a latrine. Men latrine, women latrine, and then a laundry room. So the authorities began to see that this was really a problem. They could just see it really, like fast, what would you call it, just fast, like a mood that goes real fast, that, the families are just breaking up. And so the ruling came out that we had to eat with the family. So everybody was, upset about that. But it was a very, when you think of it, it was within 3 years, there was a lot of damage done to that, to the whole makeup of the family and the community. Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
You mentioned that all the Japanese from the West Coast were sent to internment camp. How about the Japanese that were in the middle of the West, or they weren't bothered?
No. And 2 reasons why is because most of the Japanese and Asians were on the West Coast. Secondly, that's why, because they were economic competitors, that's why they were, targeted. And, there was a lot of racism and fear underneath that. They were, very frightened. But they did take away the leaders of our community. Like my father, the Issei men, and, in a Japanese community, the Issei, or the elderly, the male, were the community leaders. Well, they were all rounded up, like the FBI came and arrested my father just like that, the day after. And he was in prison in North Dakota, in a federal penitentiary there for a year. So most of these men were arrested and taken to families. So then, the young Nisei, who would have been about 22, in their early 20s, they had to assume leadership. You see, in the community and in the family, because then the fathers were taken. And then after we went into the camp, then these guys went to fight. So, it was just catch-22. But, we learned. We had to.
I have one more question. What about the Japanese in Hawaii?
No, see, that's the thing. They were much closer
Yeah.
And they also were in very important positions in the government and so forth. No, they were not. See, that to show because they didn't have a racial background in Hawaii, and they were quite a few Japanese. And in fact, that's where the 442nd began. So there was that kind of, what would you call that? It just didn't add up. The other question? How were you treated in your camp? Well, that was the hardest part. And it wasn't that we were treated anyway. I think that by being in a camp for 3 years or 3.5, 2 years out every year, and like being a child and why we were here was because we hadn't done anything wrong, so it was simply because of who we were. So, and then of course this war that we didn't know about. So when we were told, well, we're going to leave now, it was like, well, they hate us so much. Because you never saw the newspapers or anything. What will happen when we go out into the whole world? And so it's terrifying because you hear about all these, people doing these things. And that's why in the book I'm just stunned when I find out what it is that is going to be different, because I'm in the 6th grade, I go to my first day in class, and the teacher asked us to read. So I stood up to read, and I read perfectly, better than anyone else, because our schooling was so good. And then everybody turned around, and a girl said to me, "Oh, I didn't know you could speak English." Oh. So from that moment, I said, "Oh God, that's what it's about." It's just that they think I'm not American. They think I'm different because I can't speak English. I mean, I was a kid, but that was just an illumination. Because they were brainwashed too, the kids.
Can you tell us a little bit about the schooling?
In the
mentioned
camp?
it was really good, yeah.
Yeah, well, the first year, it was awful because nothing worked in the first year because the Army was in charge. So I don't mean it that way. The military was in charge, so they ran it like a camp, like a military camp. I mean, in fact, you know, most people who went to Manzanar came from Los Angeles, some from up north in Bainbridge Island. So we didn't know a cold climate, but it can really get cold in Manzanar right now. It's very, very cold. So what were we to do? We could only take in what we could carry. So we didn't even have wool. So the Army then gave us a whole bunch of World War I uniforms. World War I. These ingenious women who could really sew, we make these uniforms into capes and jackets and warm clothing for us. So, what was the original question?
What was the education at school?
Oh, so school, okay. So school was the same way. When school was, we had some of the volunteers from the camp who were teachers. It was like a recreation school. This was the first year. But then, when the military moved out of being the authority there, and the WRA came in, this was a federal civilian group, life changed. And one was that we had great teachers who came from all over the country. I mean, I just loved this one teacher who came from Wisconsin. And I always loved the state of Wisconsin because of this one teacher. I never had heard of it. She was from Wisconsin. Her name was Miss Hoover. And to this day, I love Wisconsin because of Miss Hoover. And so we did have teachers that came in. This time from outside, it wasn't like who we volunteered to teach. And we had very good schooling because when I came out, I was way ahead of my age group. They had a high school. It was very fast. Oh yeah, that's why people couldn't, they lost their property, they couldn't sell their,
And please, what happened when you got out? To the majority of the people in Manzanar, did they go back to their original communities? Did they have jobs? Did they have money? What happened to you?
that's the hardest part of it. I mean, the real story is when we came out, and most Japanese Americans who were returned will say that the really difficult time was coming out because we had started economic zero. Again, and lost their home, lost property because, for instance, my father had fishing boats. He was probably making payments by his catch, like share catching. If they arrest him, put him in prison, he can't pay for the boat, so the bank takes it. Homes, this is what happened to homes. If you're making payments, you couldn't pay anymore. So you lost your house, you lost the home. Now, some people, I mean, not all stories were tremendous. I mean, there were wonderful people who took care of other people's homes for them while they were gone. And they took care of a hot car or, silver or whatever it was.
Was your money confiscated?
Pardon me?
Was the family's money when
No,
they
I
went
think
to
it
Manzanar?
was not confiscated, but I don't think very many of us had that kind of money in the bank because they probably didn't trust the banks,
Right.
at that time.
Right.
And, we were not like, we were a very working immigrant group, farmers and so forth. I mean, the 40s and 50s, it was, 40s, it was a very different world.
I wonder if everybody here knows that there were several camps like this throughout the United States.
Yeah, there were 10. So there were 2 in California, 2 today, and Manzanar. There was 1 in Idaho called Minnesota. 1 in Wyoming called Hard Mountain. There's 1 in Colorado called Abachi. Oh, really? Oh, well, probably, yeah.
What you're saying is just
Oh, really? Yes, and then there was in Arizona and Arkansas. Yeah. The very interesting experience that I had, this was about 4 or 5 years ago, the state of Missouri had adopted parallel to Manzanar as a statewide league. And they invited me to come, for about a week to go, to their little outlying areas and schools and libraries and speak to people. They were so nice. But I really realized that Missouri is a real kind of agricultural area. I mean, St. Louis was kind of in economic depression then. But the people who picked me up when I flew in was these very professional-looking Japanese Americans, right? I said, you live in St. What are you doing here in St. Louis? They said, well, they had been in Lodi before, and they had gone, and Lodi was here in California, very, very hostile with the Japanese. Very bad. And so when they said, they didn't want to go back after the war. So they were in Jerome, Arkansas. They were in the camps there. So Missouri at the time was very short of professional people. And so a lot of the dentists and physicians, the camp went to St. Louis, and then the younger people got educated there, and they stayed there. And they're the poorest professional people in St. Louis are Japanese Americans.
Quite a few of the people from, the Japanese people from the camp in Arkansas relocated around the Chicago area.
Yes.
Because I have had a classmate who was taken away, and we connected with her afterwards, and she talked about that.
Yes. Japanese were in New Jersey because at the time, Seabrook Farms in New Jersey was just beginning freezing vegetables. At one time, they didn't have frozen vegetables. But, so they needed workers in the plant. And so some Japanese actually went from camps to New Jersey to work at these frozen food plants. And part of my family went back there. And they stayed there, and they liked, life that we. But
do you think that might have been because of the different attitude in the Midwest and the East Coast than on the West?
Yes, absolutely. Because some people in Iowa who went back to Iowa, they'd never seen an Asian person before. And there wasn't this anti-Asian feeling on the West Coast because there were more who were buying land and who were becoming business competitors. So, and it was also a political thing because in the state of California at the time, just, the Second World War just around that time, some of the politicians would say, I'll get the Japs out of the valley, I'll get them off the farms, vote for me. They used it as a political thing. So, how can you explain something like that, except that we have had to have learned so much more about how people could look at another group of people and see them as subhuman, or that not subhuman, but that they're not like you are. That's one of the advantages of television, even though, television is its opposite too. But there's much more exposure to culture.
Don't you think I think rather, that it's a very good example of how propaganda can affect the
Absolutely.
whole group of people.
How propaganda, which is advertisement. Just look at propaganda. One is telling you to go out and buy a horse, you'll get that beautiful girlfriend there. You'll get a beautiful girl sitting on the horse. I mean, it's that kind of mind fooling, So, but I really believe that we're much more educated now. We can see through that. We understand that. We just, especially when we teach our kids, I hope, that, you can't believe everything that's on that television. That's not going to make you, rich and famous and have a good bill because of whatever. So, but, it was so, it was blessed. I mean, it's amazing to me to realize that I lived during a time that would seem, not ignorant, but, innocent in their way of seeing, life.
I guess I have to ask the question, do you think that this could happen again?
Oh, certainly, we're not on top of it. Oh, that's why whenever, look, I'm going to ask in this group here, how many of you have yourself, a parent or grandparent, born in another country? Please raise your hand. Right, as yourself,
Great.
your mother, or your grandparents. So most of us are third generation or fourth generation from immigrants, okay? Now, that could happen to anybody. It's not just going to be Japanese or Germans, or it could be Irish. We're with Ireland. Anybody with an old brother, you never know how people's minds. And so that's why it's so important to that children learn in school, that we all recognize that this country is made up of immigrants. We are probably the only country in the world that is a democracy, and that we are ruled, our values, when we are ruled by a constitution. We don't have a king or a queen or somebody like that holds us together. It's the Constitution. So if we violate the Constitution, then what are we violating? Our whole purpose and our who we are. Because when they said camp, some people thought, maybe like a summer camp. It's never happened before. That's what we have to remember. Could we have imagined what's going on in Europe about the extermination of the Jews? No, we did not know about that until after the war was over. And we got the word from the papers. It was when the soldiers went in and liberated them. In fact, it was the Japanese American tank group that liberated that house. So, and the dying Jewish people in there thought, what? The Japanese? So, we, when something has never happened before, it's so unprecedented, that we're doing, they're going to take us to a place, be damaged, whatever. It's not because it's that they are used to just following, authority. There might be something to that about that they respect authority. But let's face it, already, they've taken away all the men. So who's going to fight? And what would we fight with? Because we didn't know what we were fighting. You see, and once we were in the camps, there were riots. wrapped up in like being in a prison camp, and when it's wrapped up in who you are, then you have to start realizing that you have believed yourself your own stereotype.
Right.
You believe what they were saying about you out there. But I think that happens to everybody in different ways. Whether you're white, brown, black, or whatever, in some group, you can believe the stereotype. And when you're strong enough to say, hey, that's not me, I'm not that. Then you are a real individualistic American.
So what happened when you left camp?
When we left camp, it was like, bye,
But what,
you can
I
go
mean,
now.
where did you go? Where did you have friends? Where did you have family?
Some people went back east. We probably had a social worker places in the Defense Housing Project in Long Beach.
Okay.
There were housing, so trailer camp, very few, not a large amount of the families had people take care of their house and they could go back to their home.
Right.
They were very lucky, those who owned their home, and they were able to go back. And most Japanese were like anybody else, paying off homes. And so we went back, they put us in, I'm sure these people were thinking, oh God, what a mistake, we're gonna put these people out.
And did they give you money for food, just to start off with to help you?
I think it was like $28 or something, it was very good. In those days, that was, about it. No, at least I didn't know about it. It was a tough time. The Reconstruction period was a very tough time. Because by then, nobody wanted to make waves anyway. I think it was such a kind of traumatic, shameful experience. But when people came out of camp, we never mentioned it. Even if I was with a friend who I played with in camp, we never mentioned camp. It was just like something you wanted to forget, or some shame in your.
Even with the people that have gone through it.
It's just kind of a shame for a while until, you get, it was such a blow, and then you kind of get over it. But, to have a mass internment like that, and a lot of people, that's a lot of psychic energy in one spot. And it's also about a lot of, why are we here? Because of who we are, and the propaganda was so bad about Japan. We came from that country, things like that. So there's a lot of self-hate. Not hatred, but you just couldn't accept yourself. You wanted to be, someone else. And the irony is, I think almost everybody is like that. To some degree, children, we all grow up wanting to be something else or someone else. Thank you very much.